We're going to go ahead and continue right into Jeffrey Smith.
Did you tell
And
him?
for some of you who may not know who he is, we've got just a short biography. He really is one of my heroes, and his book, Seeds of Deception, after that came out, and I read it a little over 10 years ago, it really just changed the way I understood food, what food meant, to our bodies, what particular farming practices meant to our future generations and our children. And it's a real honor and privilege that he's able to be here with us today. And actually, Jeffrey is one of the reasons that I am an organic dairy farmer today. That book so changed the way I thought about food and how it should be produced that he was a big influence on why we dairy organically today. But Jeffrey is the leading consumer advocate promoting a healthier, non-GMO choices. He is the author of the world's best-selling and #1 rated book on the health dangers of genetically modified organisms. And his meticulous research documents how biotech companies continue to mislead legislatures and safety officials to put the health of society at risk and the environment in peril. He's written a couple of books, Seeds of Deception, exposing industry and government lies about the safety of genetically engineered food you're eating, and his second book, Genetic Roulette, the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods. We also have those out on the table, as well as his latest documentary film, Genetic Roulette, for sale. Former U.S. National Institutes of Health scientist Candace Pert describes Jeffrey as the leading world expert in the understanding and communication of the health issues surrounding genetically modified foods. The last couple of days we've talked about some bad press and how Monsanto likes to attack Jeffrey and Dr. Huber. But one of the most important things to remember is that you're over the target when you're catching flack. So both these guys are catching flack from the big multinational corporations, and we just want to applaud them for that. So would you please help me welcome Dr. Jeffrey Smith. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. How many here are dairy farmers? And how many people grew up on a farm? So you have an incredible experience. And I'd love to learn some of your experience. I'd like you to start by rating yourselves from 1 to 100 how vigilant you've been at avoiding eating genetically engineered foods up till today. So 1 is bring it on, whatever you eat, doesn't matter. 100 is extremely vigilant. So most Americans on a scale of 1 to 100 are about -7. They don't know what a GMO is. So most of you may be in the lower category like the rest of Americans. So let's see. I'd like you to raise your hand if you're in the lowest category, 1 to 20. Please raise your hand. Took a look around. We'll get the numbers before. Now 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. How many people don't like raising their hand? All right, how many people grow animal feed on your farm? All right, how many people eat? Just checking. All right. Some of you said that you were pretty vigilant at avoiding GMOs. And I'd like to know how many of you noticed an improvement in your health when you took GMOs out of your diet. Can I see a show of hands? Okay. Now, do you want to share any of the symptoms that you noticed with the group that improved? You don't have to. Pardon? Less asthma. That's very, very common. In fact, I hear asthma and allergies clearing up from every single audience I ask, where there's at least 10 or 12 people that have noticed an improvement in symptoms. Gastrointestinal is every single audience. I've heard skin conditions. I've heard headaches, including migraines, infertility. One woman yelled from the back, erectile dysfunction. So I immediately said, okay, raise your hand if you have erectile dysfunction. We've heard so many incidences of diseases and disorders getting better. I've come to predict it. 2 days ago, I was in Prescott Valley, Arizona. And I had given a talk in Prescott in February. And also they started circulating my film there earlier. And a veterinarian had seen my film and then went to my talk and realized that many of the problems that she was seeing in her animals may be related to GMOs. So as she described in the interview 2 days ago, she tells everyone that she meets, every single customer, every friend, everyone she knows, to avoid eating GMOs. So you may know someone like that. It's like, here they come, look the other way. But it turns out she's had amazing changes in her animals. I said, describe some of the, okay, is that too loud? So describe, do you have any intractable problems where you've tried all sorts of things? She's a holistic veterinarian, so she'll use drugs only when necessary, she'll use herbs, she'll use acupuncture, she'll use other things. I said, well, tell me a situation where you tried everything else and the pet owner was not willing to change the diet until the last possible thing. And she says, oh yeah, we've got those. Nothing else worked for intractable diarrhea on many occasions until the GMOs were taken out. Nothing else worked in terms of allergies and itching and skin problems that were related until the GMOs were taken out. She said obesity among the animals also very common, is reversed when she takes the animals off of GMOs. And I spoke to 5 or 6 dog owners and a horse owner and chicken owner, and they all described the changes in their animals when they took them from GM to non-GM. And I talked to a pet food company, the 2 people that have a store, and they described situations with their customers where there was no drugs involved, there was no veterinarian involved. The person came in and described certain problems with their animals, and then they took the animals off of the GM pet food, put them on the non-GM pet food, and the problem disappeared. Does anyone here have a story about any animals that were taken from GM to non-GM and noticed a change? Anyone? See, you're organic, so you're not allowed to use the GM at any time while you're certifying organic. Last year I went to 5 farm conferences at the beginning of the year, and they were not organic, and so I did get some stories. And some of them are in my film, Genetic Roulette. There was a guy, I was actually in Washington State, and get picked up at the airport by a shuttle. And there was most of the people in the shuttle were from this conference. And I started having conversations. I asked the same question I just asked you. And he said, yeah, I had a client of mine, and I suggested that he take GMOs out of the diet. So he called me about 3 months ago, and he was stuttering and stammering, and I got nervous because I didn't know what he was talking about. He was real excited. And he said, remember you told me to get rid of the GM corn? And then he got nervous and said, yeah, what happened? Here's the story. He has 3,000 pigs on his farm, 4 different operations for the piglets, the nurseries. And he took the GM, he planted non-GM corn. And he was walking with one of his brothers through the nursery about 2 or 3 days after they switched the diet. And they noticed the animals had changed in their behavior quite substantially. And one joked to the other and saying, well, maybe it's that non-GMO corn. But 8 days later, 11 days after he started feeding non-GM corn, that's when he placed the phone call to the person I was speaking with in that shuttle. He said, 14 years ago, my brothers would always remind me that I had the easiest job on the farm because I was in charge of the nursery. And it was true. For some reason, raising 3,000 piglets is not a big deal. But starting 14 years ago, he ended up with the hardest job on the farm because the pigs were constantly sick. And they were also tired. And when he'd come in with the food, that's when the pigs would get up. They'd be lying down before he left the stall because they were so sickly. They blamed it on the genetics. saying the new genetics in the area, the pigs coming in from Canada, that must be the problem as to why our pigs are so sickly. But by 11 days on a non-GM corn diet, and they were still feeding the GM soy, because they didn't plant non-GM soy. They didn't have access to it. 11 days into the non-GM corn diet, the pigs were acting like piglets again. The medicine use went down dramatically by 3/4. And he realized it wasn't the new genetics. Because 14 years ago is when he introduced the genetically engineered corn. In Denmark, a farmer switched out of GM soy and started getting the more expensive non-GM soy. He didn't tell his farmhand. 2 days later, the farmhand approached him and said, "You switched the feed." He said, "Uh-oh, what happened?" He said, "No more diarrhea." They had massive diarrhea that was fatal. For 2 years, they couldn't kick it. In 2 days, it was gone. They also eliminated birth defects. Over the previous 2 years, they had 36 deaths from ulcers and bloat. That disappeared in the following year. The conception rate went up. The litter size went up. The use of antibiotics dropped by 2/3. There was a Dr. Dan Scow. Has anyone heard of Dan Scow? Okay, he passed away recently. He was a well-known veterinarian. And I interviewed him about the effects of GMOs on livestock. And he described the changes in the health of the animals that were fed GMOs soon after the GMOs introduced, more inflammatory, some gut bacteria issues. He described a situation with a South African farmer who had a dairy and pig operation. And he was having a terrible time. There was a lot of arthritic type conditions in his cows. The milk production was horrible. Reproductive rates were terrible. Pigs, a lot of cannibalism, a lot of very serious issues. The sound problem? Okay. So Dan gave him all sorts of recommendations, and he said, "Look, Dr. Scow, just give me one recommendation that I can do." And he said, "Never plant another GMO again." So he took the non-GM seeds and started planting non-GM corn. And he fed it to the animals, and 60 to 90 days, the problems disappeared. But then he ran out of the corn. He didn't have enough for the whole year, so he went to the market and he had to buy the GM corn, and all the problems returned. And finally, he planted enough non-GM corn to last the whole year, and the problems went away. But in this situation, there was something that was far more tragic. How many people have seen the film Genetic Roulette? So you know what I'm about to say. And I will preface it by a story that I heard from a former Monsanto scientist. He told me that when his colleagues at Monsanto discovered that feeding rats genetically modified corn caused health damage to the rats, instead of withdrawing the corn, the scientists rewrote the study to hide the effects. And when Monsanto does studies on corn, the most that they feed the rats are 33%. This scientist pointed out to me that in South Africa, corn is a staple. That humans will eat corn twice that amount, up to 70% of the caloric intake, and sometimes even more. And so he was very concerned that if rats being fed 11 or 33% corn diet from genetically modified corn showed damage, that the scientists had to cover up what's happening in South Africa, where they now have lots of GM corn. Well, on this farm, the farm workers were having corn 3 times a day. It was their staple. And it was only the corn grown on the farm. So they were eating 100% genetically modified corn at the highest concentrations possibly anywhere in the world. And he had 60 farm workers. He only needed 50, but he had to have 20% more because so many were sick all the time. Cold and flu-like symptoms, severe headaches, all sorts of inflammatory diseases, and he had to stock a lot of medicines. He didn't know why. But when he switched to non-GMO corn, he was monitoring the health of his pigs and cows and accidentally discovered that the health of his workers all of a sudden improved as well. And when he couldn't supply enough non-GM corn and had to buy the GM corn from the market, that's what the workers ate, and the problems returned until they were able to get non-GM corn year-round. The most striking comment that Dan Scow told me when he described his conversation with the farmer was this. He said once or twice a month, the farmer would talk to one of his employees. And he would notice that one of the eyes went in one direction and one of the eyes went in another direction. He said they couldn't track. And he said he knew from experience that within a day or two, that employee would be dead. So he was losing 1 or 2 employees a month and had no idea why. Those people in South Africa on the farm are like our canaries in the coal mine, exposed to such high concentrations of what we're eating every day. Now, I may be the person in the world that has gathered more testimonials on the health dangers of GMOs than anyone. And to me, it is like clockwork. But what I want to do is I want to share with you a pattern that I have been seeing. We don't have a single smoking gun where we have a series of more and more detailed scientific studies to isolate the causative factors. What we have is a smoking shotgun. Lots of different information when put together makes an extremely compelling story. The reason we don't have the detailed scientific evidence is because every time a scientist discovers the problem, they're fired or gagged, or they lose their funding, they get attacked. So Don and I wear it as a badge of merit that we've been under the crosshairs of Monsanto because we're touching a nerve there by pointing out what they're trying to hide. In 2009, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine evaluated the animal feeding studies on GMOs and said that based on the results of these studies, GMOs pose a serious health risk. They specifically said gastrointestinal problems, immune problems, accelerated aging, organ damage, and dysfunctional regulation of cholesterol and insulin. They said every doctor should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient. There are now thousands of doctors doing just that. And the people who are getting rid of GMOs are reporting improvements in gastrointestinal, in immune, in reproductive, in organ damage. Here's an example of what we hear. Irritable bowel, Crohn's disease, acid reflux, ulcers, gut pain, allergies, asthma, colds and flu, gluten sensitivity, infertility, erectile dysfunction, kidney disease, fatty liver, depression, violent behavior, attention span and problems, memory loss, brain fog, anxiety, plus weight problems, high blood pressure, fatigue, migraines, autistic symptoms, rashes, arthritis, insomnia, and diabetes. I've heard these type of symptoms in about 80 presentations in the last year and a half. Now, if you look at the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, they had gastrointestinal, immune, reproductive, organ damage. If you look at the humans, the same categories, plus some of the mental disorders and some of the other disorders that were not mentioned. When you talk up to the farmers and veterinarians, again, you have gastrointestinal, immune, reproductive, and organ damage. The same categories: diarrhea, gut bacteria imbalance, intestinal damage, infectious disease, birth defects, infertility, miscarriages, conception rate, litter size, liver damage. You also have violent behavior, antisocial behavior, including cannibalism, milk production, skin disorders, weight problems, and death rate. And then if you add my conversation with the veterinarian of 2 days ago, plus several other pet vets that I've spoken with, the same thing is in the pets. Gastrointestinal, immune, organ damage. And one thing about the pets, the pet owners, the pet vets, the farmers, and the livestock veterinarians, when they're describing a specific animal or herd that has switched from GM to non-GM, they always use one word without hearing anyone else saying the same thing. And that is, they say the animals are happier. And you guys would know when your animals are happier. I've heard people talk about cows that become antisocial. They don't want to hang out with the herd. They seem to be upset all the time. When they switch them to non-GMO, they seem to be happier. So we have now patterns between lab animals, humans, livestock, pets, as well as the rates of disease in the United States for these same categories. Now, there's a nexus of certain categories when put together create very popular diseases like gluten sensitivity. Does anyone here have or know someone that has gluten-related disorders? Raise your hand. Okay, you looked out there and there was gluten-free on a lot of those breads, right? It is an explosion in the United States. Now, if you look at the characteristics of gluten-related disorders, there's something called permeable gut, or holes in the intestinal walls. There's overgrowth of negative gut bacteria. There's damage to the microvilli, the little fingers that come off the intestinal walls for digestion. And there's some kind of immune response. Well, these are the same categories that have been linked to GMO consumption. So in our article, which is at glutenandgmos.com, you can see how we have created a theory that consumption of GMOs has predisposed people for more of these type of autoimmune diseases or allergic reactions or sensitivities. So we have experience of people in audiences saying, one person told me in Washington State recently, this month, her friend was gluten sensitive, took GMOs out of her diet, she's no longer sensitive to gluten. So alone, it's very questionable. As a single report, it's even hearsay in this situation. It's completely dismissible. But in the context of this pattern, it's another data point to support this smoking shotgun. Now, another testimonial. I had an autoimmune disease for 8 years. I was in different medications for it and actually had surgery for it. It was a living nightmare. I took GMOs almost completely out of my diet 8 months ago, and the symptoms are gone. Doctor said there's no cure for my disease. I found the cure. Stop eating GMOs. This is a common experience that I hear. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the 2 toxins that are found in GMOs. You've heard a whole lecture on one of them, Roundup. We're going to look at a little bit of Roundup, but most of that's been covered. We're also going to look at Bt toxin. How many people have heard of Bt corn? All right, so Bt corn is corn that is engineered to produce its own toxic insecticide. Bt comes from Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a soil bacterium. And you can take that bacteria, take a lot of it, add the spores, put it into a spray bottle, and spray it on crops, and it kills certain insects. It pokes little holes, micropores, in the gut walls, and it kills them. The bacteria from inside the gut ends up going into their bloodstream. It becomes pathogenic, and there's a whole reason why the holes in the gut will kill the insects. Now, yes?
When that organism is in the soil in the right amounts, then it actually is killing that insect.
Is that a question or a comment?
Well, no, it's a question.
I actually have never heard this question asked, and I don't know the answer. I know that when you go and you buy a spray bottle of Bt, it's concentrated bacteria and spores, but in the lower concentrations in the soil, I have no idea if it acts as a suppressant. Do you know?
The bacterium actually parasitizes the insect. So it's not in your food at all.
No, but
it will parasitize, release the toxin in the insect, and then the toxin does the damage to kill the insect.
But Don, if it's just in the soil, the background soil, does it have any effect on that low concentration, or only when it's gathered up?
It's not doing much until it parasitizes the insect.
All right, so by itself in the soil,
It's not producing much toxin to start
But
with.
if it's there in the soil, then those insects are more than likely not gonna attack those plants, right?
well, I think it's in a lot of soil. I personally, my guess is, and it's just,
We can use it in genetic for organic production. We can use the Bacillus thuringiensis as a biological control for our insect.
Yeah, but. and
We
my
can spray it
point
on, but it doesn't go in your food.
But what I'm saying is if you kill that by using chemicals and you kill that in the soil, it's just gonna make that plant a whole lot more susceptible to those insects.
True,
Yeah, okay, that's,
true. And we see insect resistance now to the Bt toxin, and also much greater damage from them because you don't have that natural biological control present.
so let's take a look at Bt toxin. How many people have used Bt on their farm or garden? All right, so Bt will wash off and biodegrade after it's sprayed. Typically within a couple of weeks, it's gone, often quicker. And the EPA claims that it's safe for consumption because it has a history of safe use in the food supply. But if you look at the actual studies on Bt, it turns out that it doesn't have a history of safe use. It's associated with certain reactions. And EPA says it's only insect specific, it has no effect on humans or mammals, and it is destroyed in the stomach digestive acid. So they completely dismiss the fact that Bt toxin will have any impact on humans or animals based on assumptions. They didn't require any testing of these assumptions. However, about 500 people in the Pacific Northwest who were exposed to Bt because of gypsy moth application reported allergic and flu-like symptoms. Some had to go to the hospital. Farm workers using Bt showed antibody responses. Mice showed immune responses and damage to their tissues. So the assumptions by the EPA turn out to be violating peer-reviewed published studies. So they're wrong. But even if they were right, they shouldn't have applied that logic because the Bt produced in the corn is quite different. It produces a toxin that's thousands of times more concentrated than the spray version. It's designed to be more toxic than the spray version. It has properties of a known allergen and it doesn't wash off. So, looking at the human and the animal studies on just the natural Bt, the EPA's own scientific advisory panel, which are typically the most qualified allergists and medical doctors and scientists in the country, they said that Bt appears to be an allergen and that we need to monitor it and evaluate it. We can't just dismiss it. However, the EPA dismissed the advice of their own scientific advisory panel and allowed Bt toxin to be produced from within the corn at high concentrations for us and our animals to consume. Now, the Bt is also being produced in cotton. And farm workers in India are reporting allergic and flu-like symptoms and itching and rashes on their bodies from touching the cotton. The thousands of sheep are reported to have died when they grazed on the cotton plants after harvest. The same sheep grazed on natural cotton for years without a problem, but the Bt cotton had something that caused sickness and death in thousands. I visited one village that allowed all of their buffalo to graze on cotton plants after harvest for up to 8 years. One day grazing on the Bt cotton plants, all 13 buffalo died. They also lost 26 goats and sheep. And most of them said to me when I asked them, they had allergic or itching type symptoms when working in the Bt fields. When mice were fed Bt toxin, or either from an experimental Bt potato or just the straight Bt toxin, they had damage to their microvilli, which is the part of the surface of the intestine that does the digestion. And the Bt toxin was found to create holes in human cells. So this study specifically said that it creates the little holes in the human cells like the holes it creates in insects. Now in insects it creates holes and allows things to flow through. It may be that the Bt toxin is creating permeable guts, leaky gut. So that will be taken to, and as food, whether it be the food particles or the chemicals that are associated with the food or the gut bacteria, that might leak out and get into the bloodstream. Now leaky gut is associated with inflammation, allergies, autoimmune disease, cancer, autism, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and numerous other problems. And if you ask the EPA about this, they may try and calm you down by saying, don't worry, the Bt toxin is destroyed in the stomach. This was done in a laboratory setting in a test tube. It'll never get to your intestines. But a study in Canada looked at the blood of pregnant women and found 93% of the pregnant women had Bt toxin in their blood. So it got through the stomach, somehow poked holes in the walls, or somehow got into the blood, possibly through little holes it created, and was in their blood and in the blood of 80% of their unborn fetuses. A mouse study showed that Bt toxin is toxic to blood cells. So if we have Bt toxin in our blood, it might be toxic to the blood cells, and if it's in the blood of the unborn fetus, there's no blood-brain barrier developed, so it might be poking holes in the brain cells of this generation, which is suffering from so many cognitive disorders. Now, if 93% of the pregnant women tested had Bt toxin in their blood, it raised a question to the authors of the study, who were shocked. Why are so many women having Bt toxin in their blood if it washes out quickly? They don't expect it to hang out there for a long time. But this was not Mexico, where they eat corn tortillas every day. Somehow they had a source of Bt toxin on a regular basis in order to allow for 93% of the pregnant women to have Bt toxin in their blood. So they speculated in the paper that the Bt toxin came from the milk and the meat of the animals that were eating the Bt corn every day. So they were speculating that the Bt toxin not only survived digestion in humans, but it survived digestion in animals, remained active, and after the humans ate the meat or drank the milk, then the Bt toxin would get in, possibly then poke holes in the cells and get into the bloodstream. But I think a more plausible explanation comes from a 2004 study in Nature Biotechnology. And this was an interesting study. They were going to test to see whether genes survived digestion, because the biotech industry said genes can't transfer to gut bacteria because genes are destroyed during digestion. We've heard that before with the Bt. Now they're saying the genes that you put into the crop are destroyed during digestion. So they made a beautiful study, very smart. They took 7 human volunteers. And these people had elastomy bags. They had their lower intestines removed. Not for the study. Did some of you think? I mean, Monsanto has been voted every year as the most evil company on earth, but that's a little blatant. I think Monsanto executives asked themselves in their quieter moments, what would Darth Vader do? So they took these 7 human volunteers, they fed them a soy burger and a soy milkshake, and they looked into the bag and were surprised to find, this was genetically engineered soy, how much intact GM soy DNA had survived passage through the stomach and small intestine and ended up in the bag. And so the only human feeding study showed that genes can end up surviving digestion, but in 3 of the 7 human volunteers, the gene, the Roundup Ready gene from the soybeans, ended up inside the DNA of their gut bacteria. It had somehow left the soybeans during the process of digestion, assuming, and figured out how to get into the DNA, integrate into the DNA of bacteria already living in our guts. And that gut bacteria was not killable with Roundup or glyphosate, suggesting that the gene remained active, that it was continually producing Roundup-ready proteins that allowed the gut bacteria to survive. Now, This was a UK government-funded study, and the UK government is pro-GMO. And they stopped funding the follow-up studies. They didn't allow any studies to see if the Bt gene from corn chips might transfer to gut bacteria. If the Bt gene from corn chips transferred to gut bacteria, it might turn our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories, producing the Bt toxin 24/7. And that may be the more plausible explanation for why 93% of the pregnant women tested had Bt toxin in their blood. So now let's just look at this toxin Bt and see which of those categories we described before it might explain. First of all, it has allergic properties or immune stimulating properties, so it might affect the rise in allergies and asthma and other immune system problems. In fact, the mice that were exposed to Bt not only reacted to the Bt, but also to other formerly harmless compounds. So it's not just the rise in allergic reactions to corn, it could be the rise of allergic reactions to food and to pollen. So the Bt alone might explain immune system problems. If you're poking holes along the cell walls of the intestines, that might explain all this inflammatory bowel, irritable bowel, diarrhea, chronic constipation, peritonitis, the whole gastrointestinal disorder. And then if it pokes holes in human cells, it might create autoimmune disease and cancer and Alzheimer's and autism, etc., related to that. So just the Bt toxin alone can explain a variety of these disorders and diseases, as well as possibly organ damage and accelerated aging. But it has a strong competitor, Roundup, to try and explain these differences. Someone had a question in the back? Did you have a question in the back? So the good news is this: corn syrup doesn't have any Bt in it, doesn't have any genes in it, doesn't have any protein in it. So corn syrup would not be a source of the Bt protein or a source of the genes that might transfer. Or corn tortillas, or polenta, corn on the cob, Fritos. Popcorn is not GMO. Popcorn has not been introduced commercially as a genetically modified product, and field corn does not contaminate popcorn. But don't pop it in corn oil, or soybean oil, or canola oil, or cottonseed oil. So we're looking just at the Bt toxin, and we can see that that might explain this whole pattern for some of the categories. Now we're going to look at the Roundup. But in a moment, I first want to show you the correlation between the introduction of Bt corn and some of the gastrointestinal disorders. So this is inflammatory bowel disease and Bt corn acreage. You can see how tight that is. This is Bt corn acreage and irritable bowel, diarrhea. Remember the pigs, they call it diarrhea in pigs. They call it irritable bowel in humans. Here is chronic constipation. Here is deaths due to intestinal infection. This is peritonitis, also gastrointestinal. And here's a 96. This is a quote I got. My husband was in the hospital 5 times last year. Doctors wanted to remove part of his intestine because it was so infected. Instead, doctors pumped him full of antibiotics for a week. When he got out of the hospital, I changed his diet and all our family food choices to non-GMO foods. Wow, what a difference. He's doing great, and food never tasted so good. So I've been told by butchers who open the GM-fed animals and the non-GM fed animals that the intestines are often paper thin and shred when they pull them out, and they're just gnarly. And you can't get sausage casings to work in the United States anymore, so they go to New Zealand to get sausage casings, from what I'm told. Also in India, when they had the Bt toxin related deaths for the sheep, they found black patches along the intestines and bile duct and liver. So that may be related to what we've just seen in terms of the toxicity of Bt. Now we're going to look at Roundup. Let's look at Roundup or glyphosate's effect on digestion. So when they fed glyphosate to carnivorous fish, they had problems with the microvilli. Now, the Bt also damaged the microvilli, but so too did glyphosate. There was also a decrease in important digestive enzymes. So you end up not being able to digest proteins as quickly. When you can't break down proteins, for example, then it gives a longer time for an allergic reaction. One of the characteristics of a food allergen protein typically is that it's hard to break down. So if you're not producing the digestive enzymes necessary to do that, it might mean that you're now reacting or could react to a variety of foods that you didn't react to before. Now, mice that were fed Roundup Ready soybeans had a reduction in their digestive enzymes, and the Roundup Ready soybeans have as much as a 7-fold increase in something called trypsin inhibitor, which inhibits the role of trypsin, which digests protein. So if you're throwing all this trypsin inhibitor by having a high GM soy diet, you might also be dismantling a key component of digestion, and it's also a known allergen. We've already seen this picture or a similar picture from Don's PowerPoint. This, the ulcerations and inflammation in the stomach. Now we may have some more reasons as to why that may be the case. Here's a testimonial. My daughter's tummy used to puff up after meals and she'd get a bellyache. She doesn't get those after meals once we went off GMOs. Another person, since switching to non-GMO and organic foods, my stomach issues are gone. This is the most common response I get when I speak to groups. Typically, the majority of people that eliminated GMOs from their diet report improved digestive health. We've seen the celiac thing. So, Don mentioned a paper that I'm going to go into a little more detail about. There was these two scientists, and one of them is named Anthony Samsel. Now, Anthony was spraying Roundup to kill weeds near his greenhouse. But he was also spraying coyote urine around his organic garden to keep the deer away. And he ran out of coyote urine. So what did he do? No. He peed into a mason jar, put it into his sprayer, and tried his own pee, because deer don't like humans either. He noticed when he came back, the weeds were dead. His urine was a weed killer. He brought his urine into his greenhouse and sprayed it on plants. It killed the plants. He stopped spraying Roundup. His pee didn't kill the weeds anymore.
And he didn't have to catch the coyote either.
Is that a homework assignment? It's an interesting assignment. And also his acid reflux disappeared, his inflammatory bowel disappeared, he had some other symptoms that disappeared. And I asked him, what do you think was the source of the Roundup in his body? He says, well, it could have gotten onto his shoes. He wasn't wearing rubber boots. Could penetrate into the leather. Could have been breathed in from the air. I mean, that's a tiny amount. And his pee had active glyphosate in it at such tiny concentrations. Now, it tells us a lot of things right there. First of all, it told him they've been lying to me, because they said glyphosate will break down in the body completely, and it didn't. Second, it tells you that you're taking in glyphosate and it's still active as it goes all the way through. So if it's active, it means it's chelating, maybe picking up some of the minerals like you've seen from Don's presentation, chelating them, making them unavailable for us to assimilate, and still there's some left that haven't been chelated enough to kill the weeds. So that got him set on a course to figure out what's going on with glyphosate. And he started studying the biochemical interactions. Now, we heard about the shikimate pathway that happens in plants, okay? One of the excuses that Monsanto has said for years is humans don't have shikimate pathways, so it's okay to feed them Roundup because it's not going to block the shikimate pathway. But our gut bacteria has shikimate pathways. The gut bacteria uses the shikimate pathway to produce 3 amino acids, including tryptophan. Tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin. Serotonin to melatonin. If you have lower levels of serotonin and lower levels of melatonin, that might explain some of the mental disorders, some of the cancer, insomnia, other things we've heard from people who are experiencing problems when eating GMOs. Without proper serotonin, you might have more stress, you might eat more, because serotonin tells the body, I'm full, stop eating. So you might continue to eat. Now, glyphosate also kills the beneficial gut bacteria, as Don mentioned. So it's knocking the shikimate pathway so that the bacteria can't produce the good stuff. It's killing the other beneficial bacteria, including like bifidus or bifidobacteria, which suppresses inflammation. And then if it grows the negative stuff, then that overgrowth of the negative gut bacteria produces something called zonulin, and zonulin can then break apart the junctions in the gut walls in the intestines, causing more leaky gut. So you have Bt causing leaky gut because it's poking holes, and then you have the overgrowth of negative gut bacteria maybe causing leaky gut. Then you have the disruption of the walls along the intestines. Whenever there's a disruption along the walls of the intestines, it doesn't produce as much of a hormone called CCK, which tells the pancreas produce more digestive enzymes. So now what that means, shortcut, this overgrowth of gut bacteria, the holes poking for the Bt, it may suppress the digestive enzymes even further. Now, if you have undigested food proteins because you're not digesting them, and you have holes in the gut walls, those undigested food proteins bump out into the bloodstream. When they get in the bloodstream, the immune system attacks them as a foreigner. And when they attack, that's inflammation, that's a food allergy. But then the immune system takes a mugshot of the intruders and says to the rest of the immune system, attack anything that looks like this. Sometimes there's something called molecular mimicry, where it takes the mugshot, and when the immune system processes it, it starts to attack things that look similar, like thyroid, like microvilli, like pancreas, autoimmune diseases, which are on the rise enormously since GMOs were introduced. And autoimmune diseases like celiac disease are related to permeable gut, leaky gut. So when we look at this, and we look at another thing that Roundup does, it's amazing how many things it does. It blocks another pathway, which I first heard about from Don. We were at some event together, and he said, you know, I heard that it's not just the shikimate pathway, there's also the cytokine P450 pathway. I'm like, what did you just say? I had never heard of it before. But this very intelligent paper, which I can hardly read because it's so much biochemistry, talked about how these CYP450 enzymes, which every functional medicine doctor knows about. I just gave 6 talks to medical conferences in the last 10 weeks, and this CYP450 was mentioned a lot of times. They all know that this pathway helps detoxify the body. It helps you get in 2,4-D, you get in formaldehyde, you get all this stuff. These enzymes help usher that out of the body. So what does glyphosate do? It shuts down that capacity in a big way so that it enhances the toxic values of all the other stuff that we're breathing and touching and eating. So it is so vast in what it does. This 49-page paper looked at all these different diseases. They had to stop because they ran out of space. They now have 2 more papers they're going to submit. But in this paper alone, they linked Roundup to gastrointestinal disorders, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, depression, autism, infertility, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, anxiety, and violent behavior. If you want to hear an hour-long interview with one of the scientists from this paper, she speaks in Science, then I translate it into English. You can go to my blog at Responsible Technology, or just Seneff, S-E-N-E-F-F, and Jeffrey Smith, and you can find it on YouTube, more than 70,000 hits. So this shows what I just described. It also relates to tyrosine, which is related to dopamine, which is related to Parkinson's disease. So there's all sorts of things. I'll just read you some more. Bile acid production, stabilizing the blood. I mean, it's so detailed. Obesity. And Roundup, of course, can produce the aflatoxins and the other fungal pathogens that are also toxic to us that can end up in our food, which then become we become more susceptible to. Now, Don already mentioned this. Okay, so here's senile dementia tracked with glyphosate use in the United States, deaths from senile dementia, deaths from Parkinson's disease, to glyphosate as well as to acres planted in soy and corn. This is diabetes. Diabetes is interesting. Mice that were fed Roundup, fed a GM corn, they had over 400 changes in the way their genes function. And the category that had the most changes were those that regulated insulin. Another study showed that animals had a 10% increase in blood sugar. And in the lecture that I interviewed Stephanie Seneff in that video, she describes how the cells normally can store sugar until it's needed. But the biochemical damage that occurs as a result of glyphosate can destroy the ability of the cells to store the sugar. So when you eat something that has sugar, it can't pull it out of the blood supply to store it. So that spike then becomes much higher than normal, which might, of course, lead to insulin problems and type 2 diabetes. Take a look at this trend line here. You can't see from the back, but there's a green line that goes right along here. So that means if you just take the incidence of diabetes up to this point when the GMOs and glyphosate was introduced, it's basically flat. If you take that influence out, that's what it looks like. Just when the glyphosate was introduced here, that's when the diabetes starts to skyrocket in the United States. And by the way, I have heard people in lectures that I've given say when they switched to non-GMO foods and to organic foods, the diabetes disappeared. This is acute kidney injury. We heard from Seralini's study that the rats that were fed Roundup Ready corn, or Roundup Ready corn sprayed with Roundup, or the Roundup without the corn, they all had kidney damage and liver damage. Here's end-stage kidney disease. This is more kidney disease. This is kidney and pelvis cancer. This is thyroid cancer. This is liver cancer. And of course, Don's slide showing that these are the organs that concentrate glyphosate. This is a picture of the livers on the right side of rats that were fed Roundup Ready soybean. You can notice the complete difference in the structure of these livers. The technical term here I call gnarly. So this is a testimonial. My husband was told several years ago that he has fatty liver. So when switching to non-GMO and organic foods at my husband's and last doctor's visit, his fatty liver has improved. This is hepatitis C incidence in the United States, liver inflammation infection. This is high blood pressure. This is autism. Now, in autism, we have several testimonials. Here's one. It made a huge difference. He has become much more social, much more caring, empathetic, and plays with other children. In the film Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, we have 3 parents talking about their child before and after they removed GMOs from the diet. Before I get to this slide, I want to tell you a story about one of the authors of that study we just talked about, Stephanie Seneff. She's a genius. And she had figured out, looking at the research, what the physiological changes were in autistic kids. And she figured out why those physiological changes resulted in autistic symptoms. She could see the inflammation of the brain, she could see the problem in the cholesterol sulfate transport, she could see the problems in the gut bacteria, and she understood the A to Z from the changes in the physiology to the cognitive impairment, etc. But she couldn't get to the A. She couldn't figure out why these kids were having those physiological changes. What was causing all those changes in their gut bacteria, in their gut, in these metabolic pathways? Until she attended a lecture by Don Huber. She said to me she was sitting at the edge of her seat for 2 hours because what he was describing, what he just described to you earlier, she was putting it into her mental computer and everything lined up. This was getting to those physiological changes for her. And she feels confident that she knows that there is a link between the incidence of glyphosate and the increase in autism in the United States. Now, Roundup is also an endocrine disruptor, and so it can affect reproductive health. This is a picture of rat testicles that changed from pink to blue when rats ate genetically modified Roundup Ready soybeans. And I like to use this opportunity to get a slow drink of water so that you can watch the slide for a while. Guys, I like to marinate this. So when mice were fed Roundup Ready soy, they also had damage to their testicles, included damage to the young sperm cells. Female rats had damage to the uterus and ovaries. The embryo offspring of mice whose parents were fed Roundup Ready soy, their DNA functioned differently compared to the embryo offspring whose mothers and fathers ate non-GMO soy. Mice that ate corn that was a combination of BT and Roundup stacked, they had fewer babies and smaller babies. Now, I went to the European Parliament to give a talk on GMOs with a panel, and one of the people on the panel was Irina Ermakova, who's from the Russian Academy of Sciences, and she gave me the following slides. So these are Russian-speaking rats, and they volunteered for a soy experiment. So they ate genetically modified soy or non-GM soy starting 2 weeks before they got pregnant. And they continued eating the soy through lactation, and then the offspring started getting the soy as well. And more than half of the babies of the GM-fed group died within 3 weeks, compared to only a 10% death rate when the moms were eating the non-GM soy. The babies were also smaller and could not reproduce. So most of them were sterile. We were going to use it for rat poison. So when you asked that, that reminded me of a story. So I was sitting with her in the European Parliament, right? And she tells me the story I've heard over and over again from all these scientists around the world. She said when she published her research, or when she announced it and then published it, there was all this attack from all over the whole usual suspects from around the world. From every continent, they have the biotech brigade. They all get the certain talking points. They all say the same thing, and then they say it's scientific consensus. So she said her boss was under pressure from his boss, and so she was told no more GMO research. So papers were burnt on her desk to intimidate her, samples stolen from her laboratory, and after she was blocked of any more GM research, one of her colleagues tried to comfort her by saying, well, maybe the GM soy will solve the overpopulation problem. So what happened was there was a journal, Nature Biotechnology, that set her up to make her look bad. They said, we want to hear a summary of your study. She says, I want to publish the study. She says, no, you can just tell us a summary over the phone, or if you want to send us something, we would like to publish that as an essay from you. It was a setup. So she goes, but I want to publish it. She goes, no, we don't need the details, just a summary. So she sends the summary. They do a layout and a, quote, galley proof by Irina Ermakova, send it back to her to show her that they're going to publish her summary. It turns out they didn't publish the summary. They published a report, her paragraph, and then a critique of her paragraph by 4 pro-biotech advocates who have no experience in animal feeding studies. It was them that approached Nature Biotechnology to set this whole thing up. So they had lied to Irina Ermakova and smashed her summary. They had about 42 different ways that they were saying, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, and about 35 of those